I consider myself a visual historian. I consider myself an artist who uses photography. I know that's heresy, but that's the way it is. I'm a documentary social historian, and I've gotten myself involved in the world.
He made a point to correct me when I called him a great jazz photographer. He said he's a visual historian.
Goes way back, 1960, over 50 years. That's when I look around, a lot of these folks are no longer with us. Getting old is no fun.
And he's documented all the jazz greats. He actually toured with them, was friends with them, and had the relationship with them that you could see come through.
You know, a lot of people think jazz is happy-go-lucky, but if you go underneath, you really could feel the pain and then anger that a lot of the musicians felt. And as a young photographer at the time, I knew but didn't know this kind of thing. But in retrospect, many years later, I realized that it was not too great a time for black jazz musicians especially.
We had been exploring the relationship between blacks and Jews, a conversation that really needs to happen. And we like to use the arts as a way in. Well, now we have the opportunity to use photography with musicians as a way in. We were introduced to Bob Yellowlees of Lumiere Gallery. Bob Yellowlees has a very deep collection and connection to a lot of Jewish photographers, or photographers who may have documented Jewish subjects. And he was showing us all of these amazing photographers. The work of Herb Snitzer really stood out.
When we decided to do the exhibition, I had to do an initial trip down to see Herb. So when we go down there, walking through, and we're just assessing what Herb has. Do we have enough to do an exhibition? And it was clearly evident that Herb had plenty of images to fill up this entire space with a beautiful exhibition. We were in this mode where I had gone down, looked at the work, picked out what I wanted to use for the show, sorted through, going to be jazz and Herb's human rights. Those were the two things, because there are both these two concurrent themes that drove his life. And he had his period where he was actively in the jazz world, but the human rights element, which was part of the jazz world, that never stopped.
The bittersweet piece of all of this is that in December of 2022, Herb passed away. So we at the Bremen are really proud to be able to help present this film about his life and his work.
I was in the military when I really became very seriously involved with photography. And that goes back a long time. And I was also good at it, which is always a helpful way to start, you know, when you're young and wanting to make a statement and find that you're able to do so and that people were interested. So that just kept me going, that whole idea. And of course, I had my own ideas about racism and civil justice and equality, just as a person.
Well, my first encounter with Herb, meeting Herb, was more or less, it was interesting because he wanted to know more about me. And first he was adamant that he wanted to know what I was doing, what I've done, and just more, and why I was interested. And that told me a lot about him, because he, even though the focus was on him, he wanted to share that moment with me. And he wanted to, make sure that I knew how important I was in that process. And I think that is what actually probably won over a lot of the jazz musicians, because of that sincerity that Herb brought and that sincere love of humanity.
1950, I graduated high school. I geared towards the arts to begin with, so it just captured me, and it has fulfilled my creative juices all these years, And it was all happening in New York, and I was 25 years old, and it was just glorious. After being in the military, I went back to school in Philadelphia, knowing that I was headed for New York, but I wanted to get a degree. What I tried to do was to emulate photographers such as Henri Cartier-Bresson. Once I set my sights on photographing in a particular way, I wanted to see if I can make it as expressive as what the musicians were doing. It was a great time. It was a dangerous time too. But it was living in New York at that time. You couldn't ask for anything more than that as a photographer.
Growing up down here, all I wanted to do was to sound like what I called at the time a New York jazz piano player, which is bebop piano player. It's interesting looking at this exhibit, because I didn't realize how much of this stuff, I had already been intimately familiar with. His famous Thelonious Monk pictures, something I remember seeing as a kid before I heard Thelonious Monk's music, and said, I gotta hear this guy. What's really special about a lot of these photos is that, in my life, is that there were things that I saw a lot of times before I heard the music and inspired me to want to hear the music, like that Thelonious Monk one. There's some Louis Armstrong ones too.
How I first met Herb was through my time at the Museum of Fine Arts, and that's kind of how the interactions started. And at the time, I didn't really realize who I was meeting. Herb was, this gigantic figure in the arts world. I had just been introduced to him. He came off as a really, really nice guy.
It was really interesting speaking with Herb. He had a lot of great stories about Lester Young and being so close to his saxophone and stuff. I thought one thing that was really cool to me about what he does is it's not just that it's obvious to me that he wasn't just saying, I like taking photos and I want to take photos of musicians. He really, had a mission to elevate these people's work, especially them being Black artists.
The first thing I saw was the iconic image of John Coltrane in the mirror. There was depth of feeling, and he had it.
His work is very simply composed. Not a lot of people are able to do that. In the street photography kind of genre, or, it usually ends up being a little messy or whatever, and somehow his are always still really clean.
Jazz, for me, is freedom. It's a metaphor for freedom. And I've always seen jazz in this light. No matter how it was manifesting, it was a cry, and still is a cry, for freedom.
I remember I took some piano lessons with Dr. Billy Taylor, and he said that to him the process of learning jazz was imitate, assimilate, innovate. And innovate is paraphrasing for finding your own style. But I guess what's special about his photos in particular, and comparing it with music, is that they remind me more of what you take away from a painting in a lot of ways. You just feel a vibe from the photos.
It's just one thing led to another in New York, and And I was right smack in the middle of it at that time. So it was an exciting time to be in New York.
The thing that he grabbed onto quickly was the metronome, and he really pursued those jobs. And I think it was fairly short order, and he was on staff. I mean, it was a small staff. There was really, from looking through the fronts of the magazine, it was really 2, 3, 4 people were the whole entire magazine. But he got on and then rode that to the end and then kept going. But it was really his ticket, because the musicians all got to know him and knew he was with metronomes.
I moved to New York and I wanted to become a freelance photographer. So I started going to all of the magazines because it was New York. That's where the publishing industry was in those days. So that's how it got started with jazz. I walked into the offices of Metronome. They looked at the portfolio. Bill Koss was the editor then. Next thing I know, a week later, he called me up and asked me if I wanted to have a gig. And I said, well, what would I be doing? He said, well, you'd be photographing Lester Young. I was so naive about the jazz world. I said, who was he?
His mindset, his life experiences up to that point, and his kind of openness of his character, and just all the things that make up Herb, I think it was kind of the perfect mix.
Bill was very patient and hired me on as a freelance photographer, and that got me started. Edward Steichen was a very important part of my early career. Grace M. Mayer, and that name is very significant in the photographic world, but you'd never know it. She was the curator of photography at the Museum of the City of New York. And I took my portfolio to her for her to really to buy. I was looking to sell my work. She, Grace, had taken a job at MoMA. She invited me to meet Steichen and to bring a portfolio. I went to the Museum of Modern Art. I met Grace. She took me down the hall, and Steichen saw the work. I met him, we talked, and he said, I'd like to buy 2 of your photographs, which he did for $25 a piece. Now, $25 back in those days was a lot of money, but still, coming from Steichen, that was just wonderful, and it put me in the collection at the Museum of Modern Art.
His personality is such that he just would blend in. And he actually credits his diminutive size and some of his personality as he would just kind of get in there and try to disappear. And I think early on, again, he was metronome. And I think early on they're like, oh, well, he's the quite nice guy who's doing us all a favor all the time, because, you know, they all wanted publicity. They all want to get their thing out. And so I think very early he got a kind of a certification of he's a good guy. And because he is a naturally good guy, he was able to keep it and build on that. I still think photography is magic, you know? Lester Young, and he was very patient with me, as was Louis Armstrong when I photographed him for the first time. I mean, that was a thrill. And I was supposed to keep a stiff upper lip, you know, and be very professional, and there I was with the greatest early jazz singer of all time, Louis Armstrong.
Honey, I was the one who taught you all you know. Your little old friend said you to make me sing another song. I'm a good luck.
I made that photograph of him when we were on the bus going on a tour.
And that was a kind of a no-brainer on what was going to be the signature image. That's one of Herb's signature images. And I think it really plays to him because when he saw that Star of David, it was not lost on Herb. He didn't find that one in the dark. When he was standing there, he was just like, Louis Armstrong has a Star of David. It was, he knew it in the moment, and he didn't know the backstory about it at that point. We would come to find out, but it definitely caught his eye.
It's wonderful to be in his presence. Plus the fact that he got a hell of a trumpet player. They ought to put a statue of him up there in Broadway, But some people are really very interested in the fact that he's wearing a Star of David, And the whole Karnofsky family, which took him in, fed him, clothed him, gave him security in a way. And they gave him that Star of David for one of his birthdays. And he wore it his whole life.
During this period of time when Herb and Louis had their interaction, it was the early 60s. He was a lot on the road. He had his group of, I think, 5 or 7 musicians that would go on the road. Louis Armstrong had 2 different bass players, Mort Herbert and Jack Lesberg. And they were both white Jewish guys. Once Herb found out Louis's backstory, in his mind, he always thought this is him giving back. He saw Louis Armstrong as one of just an exemplary human. And it was Herb's personal theory that he had these Jewish bass players due to the fact that he was still paying homage to the Karnofskys and his early life story.
And I think that was his way of paying back for people taking care of him, that's my romantic way of seeing it, but Louis was very thoughtful, very thoughtful. A number of jazz players called him an Uncle Tom, because he was doing the whole Hello Dolly routine and all of that kind of schmaltzy smile, the handkerchief, But that was his thing.
It's not just documentation in a portrait, it's making an artistic piece that captures that moment. Herb's done that throughout all of his work, so I think that's what really strikes me when I look at any of the portraits, but the Louis and Miles ones are prominent.
He has a large print of Louis hanging above his mantle. So that was the perfect thing, and I noticed at that point, Louis has his Star of David and Herb had his Star of David, so I take the photographs. I had to comment to Herb, like, well, are you're doing this as an homage to your photograph. And he said, well, actually, it's a little sad. He goes, I wasn't a person who historically had worn a Star of David all the time. He goes, but just recently, and this was a few years back, he goes, just recently he had lunch with a friend who was a retired professor from Eckerd College. And it kind of upset Herb because at that point in time, there was a fair amount of anti-Semitic activity. And Herb commented to him, like, you don't have on your Star of David. And he said, well, Herb, he goes, I just don't want to put a target on myself. He goes, it just seems like there's just these random acts of violence and anti-Semitism seems to be growing. He goes, I'm just not going to wear it. And that really upset Herb. And from that point forward, Herb wore a Star of David. And it wasn't because he had a famous photograph of a musician who wore a Star of David. It was for his friend. And it was for his friend because Herb just did not filter the world that way. He was out there in the street with his camera, making very clear his intention and what he was doing. And he didn't mind whatever slings and arrows came his way.
Herb was able to really convey that emotional power in his work. He was able to get that guard down to where people were themselves. The wonderful thing about photography is that he was able to capture that moment and have it recorded.
He has an interesting personal history and background just from his upbringing. And again, it was this almost kind of perfect storm. He's a young man, he shows up in New York, he's kind of all queued up to have this happen. And it was just this, you drop the catalyst in and the crystals form. It really, the evidence is on the walls.
If you're going to name two people, it's Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. But Duke was, he was different. He was different. He was so creative in his writing. He just stood apart, so to speak, from everybody else. He just had it. You could see it and feel it in his body when he was conducting. He really believed in himself and in the music that he was playing, and people loved him. Jazz was a very small part of a very big picture of music and how it was developing and so on and so forth.
I remember my mother, she used jazz to let us know how she was feeling. When I heard Dave Brubeck's da-dun, da-dun, dun, dun, da-dun, da-dun, dun, dun, I knew it was gonna be pancakes, good, it was a full meal. I knew she was feeling a certain way. When I heard the Jazz Crusaders, I felt the same thing, and so the music reflected for me as a child, letting me know what her passion was, and she passed that on to me. I didn't realize it for a long time, but then later is when I reconnected with that, with the whole idea of jazz and how jazz pretty much connected worlds.
He was trying to stay out of everybody's way. He was trying to grab his images. He was inserting himself and being insertive as a photographer, but not as his personality, because his personality is very genteel. He's like a dog with a bone when there's a picture he wants, but he's not a barking dog. I mean, he's driven to the end, but his personality is such that he just would blend in.
They were young. Bird died when he was 35. I mean, Lee Morgan, I can name a whole slew of jazz musicians who got involved with too many things they should never have gotten involved with. And then you had Miles Davis, who stood apart and created wonderful, heartfelt, raw tunes, almost symphonic in nature.
And so I think jazz allows us to explore life in many different ways, and the diversity of life. And with jazz, there's no wrong notes. There's just that point of where you fail to explore that note. And so that's one of the brilliance of Miles Davis, I think, is because he's willing to go where many wouldn't go. In that sense, I love that genius from him. And so I try and just build on the whole concept of jazz musicians and their passion for their work.
Miles was very, very difficult. And I don't know anyone who could say that he was their friend. I mean, he was one of the very few jazz musicians who I really didn't get to know. I was able to be blessed with the images of Miles that I made, but as a person, he was just something else. It's like Toscanini said about Wagner. As an artist, I take my hat off to him, or as a person, I put it back on.
My response when I saw the Miles Davis photo, I pulled back, like my body went back. And then I looked at the eyes of all of his works. I think that's his best selling piece. It's stark and it's raw and it's angry and it works.
That image of Miles Davis, it said everything. It was, I think it was just iconic, because he captured something in the spirit of Miles Davis. You saw, I think, more than just the individual that was, just this antagonistic, character.
Miles was, going through a lot, and jazz was hard at the time. The community there was a little bit cutthroat, but Miles obviously is a prominent figure that arose from that.
1990, Herb's in his 60s. He's the mature photographer. When he takes that one to Miles Davis, he said when he was clicking the shutter, he knew he was making history. He knew that that was going to be a signature image of Miles Davis, because somebody else was talking to him and asking him a question, and he was in this reflective pose, and he's just kind of staring off.
Because, if you get to know Herb, he's one of those people that he's genuine. And I just think Miles couldn't open up all the way.
And and a lot of people put it on the fact that he was black. But that had nothing to do with it. Miles came out of a home where his father was a dentist. He had horses as a kid. He lived the upper middle class life. It was difficult because he was so talented at the same time.
I look at the Miles print. You have to take all of that into consideration. And then you're just left with this beautiful piece of artwork too that represents one of the most prominent jazz figures of the time.
It shouldn't have taken them so long to understand this, that life is cruel and it can be very heartbreaking, and you got to drive through it and live with it and move on, And he never seemed to grow up.
You saw a person. He found humanity within him. He found some almost a tenderness, but at the same time, you saw that veneer, that it was there, that edge that was always there. And ironically, I saw the same things in several of the images that Herb had with Nina Simone.
I considered myself a photographer of jazz artists. I became well known with them, and many of them became friends. Nina Simone became the strongest friend in the jazz world that I had. Jazz musicians had a very, very difficult time. That's why they all look so tired. They made great music, which reflected the pain and heartache. A lot of people think jazz is happy-go-lucky, but if you go underneath, you really could feel the pain and then anger that a lot of the musicians felt. And as a young photographer at the time, I knew but didn't know this kind of thing. But in retrospect, many years later, I realized that it was not too great a time for black jazz musicians especially.
My sister actually played more Nina Simone. That's what's interesting, and my sister was very dramatic. So I think Nina Simone touched on her a certain way. And so, she could say things that she wanted through Nina Simone. And for me, I think what captured Nina Simone is from being, during the summers, my sister and I would go to Mississippi. And when I heard Mississippi Goddam, that was it. That told part of my life. And understanding, it's like I felt that, I was like, why is this like this? I was like, and the fact that she said it, that to me was just brilliant.
You don't have to live next to me, just give me my equality. Everybody knows about Mississippi, everybody knows about Alabama, everybody knows about Mississippi. Come down. That's it.
You think about it, the rhythms and everything are very up and perky. But what she's saying is like she's very indignant there. And I think that piece really stated the conflicts within Nina Simone that Herb was speaking to.
Nina was very, instrumental to Herb in a lot of ways. So one of the early assignments was Cool Pics Record, the amazing Nina Simone. They needed some photography, so he gets that job. And Nina at that point was living in Philadelphia, which is where Herb grew up. So Herb goes back, he rents a studio. They did this wonderful session, multi-hour long photo session. Everybody had a great time. Everybody was in a good mood. And it was just kind of magic. So I think that kind of cemented in his relationship with Nina. They started with that. And then he's in New York, she's in New York. They have these Philadelphia ties. He said they really became just very good personal friends. They really had always just kind of hit it off.
Don't let me be misunderstood.
I was really into Nina Simone. And so then I found out that he knew Nina Simone and had photographed her. I love the picture of her on the profile with the heels, and she's laughing and she's leaning back. I mean, she's a great artist. I know that she would have been even more famous and had more work, but then, she was really troubled for good reason.
I'm just a soul whose intentions are good. Oh Lord, please don't let me be misunderstood.
I was very close to Nina for many years. She was, people had a hard time with her. She had a hard time with people. And it's amazing how a number of jazz disc jockeys came down on her, They just didn't understand that this was a great talent and she was going to do it her way, which she did, much to her detriment.
I choose to reflect the times and the situations in which I find myself. That to me is my duty.
I love the one in Nina Simone laughing. That's my favorite because it's such a spontaneous moment and it's somebody that but really have never seen like that. I love it.
One of the photos that I found so striking was one of him and Nina Simone just, chucking it up, in her dressing room, kicking back. And, and I loved that photo. And he was like, oh yeah, I was like, but he didn't think as much of it, but he was like, yeah, I was just fooling around with that, but that's her.
And but this is how she was, and you had to accept it. I stayed in touch with her for 30 years. I photographed her as to do a cover for Cool Pics Records. And that's how we first met. Columbia Records used my photographs of her. And we just hit it off. We were the same age. And we just had a good time with each other, which one of the photographs of her laughing that I made that was Nina for me. That was her for me. I loved her. She was a wonderful person.
We all know the history, and you say Nina Simone, and, volatile is a word that would kind of come up. And Herb only has wonderful things to say about Nina.
Wish I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all chains still binding me. Yeah. Wish I could say all the things that I can say when I'm relaxed.
Probably my favorite photo of Herb's would be the John Coltrane that I saw. I love a lot of his work. I always come back to that. I love the Lester Young picture a great deal. I love everything in the jazz portfolio.
Well, I could intellectualize it, but when it happened, it just happened. And I rode the train, so and we didn't stop for any station. We just kept hustling down the road, so to speak. It was like a whole new way of living life, and I grabbed hold of it. It's like the carousel, with the brass ring. You know, I jumped on that carousel and I pulled that ring, you know.
Herb basically identified with people. He really championed causes of those who were oppressed. He realized Jewish people were oppressed, and so he felt a responsibility to also work with others that were oppressed.
I think that Herb was drawn to the jazz and the civil rights. Well, the jazz comes out of civil rights. The jazz is about struggle. The jazz has not only is it gorgeous and improvisational and creative, but it's also has a deep sadness and it has a rage to it as well.
It's an integral part of who Herb is that his work has meaning. I think that's what drove him from the very beginning. And you see that from from the streets of Harlem taking pictures of little kids and NAACP demonstrations. He talked about even like jazz in some ways is civil rights and those kind of things, because it gave people back then who didn't have a voice. And therefore, as any good artist, that's what's coming forward, right? It's who you are and what you give to the world.
I know he can relate to this. I know he went to a concert, a classical concert, when he was very young, and he went in and sat down, and everybody with black skin, dressed to the nines, were sitting, up high and in the back in the worst seats, and he thought, that's wrong. And I know that he never got over it. He had majored in furniture design from the Philadelphia College of Art. He goes to New York. He gets a job at the Waldorf Astoria. And his first job was design a ballroom. His boss favored him, took him under his wing, took him to the opera, and things were going really well. And then Herb's parents came to visit him. And the boss and Herb went to the train to meet the parents. When Herb's parents stepped off the train, then his boss saw that Herb's parents were Jewish. And within 1 week, Herb was gone from that job. And so I think this is going to affect a person, and growing up as a child, having suffered in that way. And when you are oppressed and you suffer in a particular way, hopefully you have more compassion for another person when they're suffering. Not less compassion, more compassion.
Herb's family left Eastern Europe in the early 1900s because of persecution over there. Herb was very aware of this. And Herb documented not only these amazing jazz musicians, but he became really a journalist of social change, social justice, human rights. All of those things were important to him.
I've always felt this connection between Jews and blacks anyway. And the whole civil rights movement, there's a whole, you could see it in all the photographs that are made. The lineup of the people who would march would be an integrated group of people in it. And it was wonderful times, scary times, people died. That's why when people say, well, I'm not going to vote in the next election, I say, hey, vote. You're stepping on the shoulders of people who are no longer around, but they made it possible for you to do what you're doing.
He ended up going to a citywide high school. That high school was more multicultural, black, white, Jewish, whatever. And I think that was some of his first exposure and realization of racial issues. When he found himself in this situation, I think it just reinforced these beliefs and things that he had experienced in his life. And I think it was another way that he felt he could make a difference. So I think early on, he saw that it was a struggle of race and music and just civil rights, and he saw that all just intertwined. He was a street photographer at the same time, and he was documenting on the streets, those same things. The jazz and his acceptance, and again, it played to, sometimes you're a photographer, it doesn't matter if you're Jewish or not Jewish, you're out, you're shooting work, you have an interesting photograph, it is what it is. But with the jazz, his Jewish connection was written into the DNA of these images. So with Herb's work, it was focusing on the jazz and then also focusing on the human rights aspect.
He wasn't one that just put himself in a silo and said, this is what we've done, or he was one that he understood humanity, that it's bigger than any individual group. It's a collective group. And if that collective group is spoiled by, isolated, areas of injustice, it doesn't connect. And I think that's what Herb saw in the civil rights movement. He saw that it was really human rights, and if you don't have those rights, then we're all spoiled. We're all rotten. We can't just go along with it. We have to do something in some way, and we have to, in our heart and our passion and our minds and our effort and our resources, pay homage to it and make a difference. And that's what I think Herb tried to do with his art.
It's a life's work. It's not a single image, although single images can come out of it, which, like some of mine, have become classic within the music genre. But that's only part of me. I see myself as being someone who, over many years, have documented the changing of a culture, the maturation of people. Like I have these early photographs, I have these later photographs, and do they tell the same story, or is there a different story? And if there is, what is the story? I take it very seriously. I just don't. When I used to teach at the Art Institute of Boston, I used to say to the kids, what's in here? Not what's in the TV screen, but what's in here? Where do you fit within your world? What are you trying to do? What do you want to do?
What he cared about, and what makes his photography also wonderful too, is what he cared about was people.
He kind of embarked on a different track for a period of time, for about 15 years, and then came back more to photography. And Nina Simone was also very important to that. So in '86, they had not contacted each other in years. And in '86, Nina Simone was playing in Boston. And at that point, Herb was living in Cambridge. So he thought, okay, I'm just gonna, you can ask him how he found out, but he found out where she was staying. He just goes, knocks on her hotel room door, and like old friends, Herb, where you been? Nina, where you, So they get together. He helps, she goes, you coming to the show tonight? Yeah, come backstage, blah, blah. And the picture of Freddie Hubbard that's over there is backstage of that evening, and they were joking around after the show. And later in the year, she was doing a couple concerts near the end. And she called Herb up and she said, I can't really pay you, but will you come and photograph? I'm doing 2 or 3 concerts in Bern. And will you come over? And he goes, I'll get you a plane ticket. I'll take care of all your expenses. But will you come photograph? So Herb goes, yeah, sure, I'll do that. He goes over and she introduces him to the organizer of the Bern Jazz Festival. He hires Herb on the spot to come in '87 to photograph the Bern. Will you be the photographer for my festival next year? And so through that connection, he got that, and he did that for '87, '88, and '89. And what it really did was it really revitalized Herb's career, because he has these great stories of these different musicians who were in Bern, and they're like, Herb, like, where have you been for 20 years? Like, they hadn't seen him in 20 years.
I still photograph with film. Many of my photographs have this edge around it, this black edge around it, because of the comment that I wanted to make that I'm still using film.
I don't know. I think black and white will remain with us. Black and white silver gelatin, even as technology goes on. I just think it's too beautiful a medium. There will be a history in the future of black and white, which I'm thankful for.
I think what makes Herb's work unique, part of it is just the humanity that shines through, but he also has like just a great eye, he doesn't even usually crop things. Like when you see his photographs and you'll see the edges because he wants you to know, like, this is the photograph I took. He is able to like capture things amazingly, like that moment that you're just like, how did you even see that moment, let alone capture it?
Black and white obviously is a foundation to Herb's work. It's universal throughout all of it. But I don't know if that was a deciding factor in what made those images so magical. I think it was more so the context that he had and the relationships that he had. And then his ability to just be a great photographer. I mean, Herb could have made those images in color just as magical, I think, as they are in black and white, but that comes down to his ability to interact with them and just get into that zone where people feel vulnerable. I think that's what the magic Herb has and showed in that work that he was making.
It's just fascinating when you see the photographs because you're just like, wow, and it has an energy, that energy of like capturing that perfect moment, right? The decisive moment.
I have this photograph of Barack Obama with this black edge around it, Well, what am I trying to say about him? I love the guy. Photography is a lifelong process. It's not just snap now. And, today the kids, they'll snap one and look at it, snap again and look at it. And while they're looking at it, something exciting is going on. It's like, come on, guys, tell me about who you are. Don't tell me about who you are in relationship to a showbiz. Just who are you? And what do you want to do with the camera? Because it's a powerful piece of equipment. It can change the world. And I used to point out Martin Luther King at that point. One little guy, no bigger than me, could change the world.
A lot of his work, as you know, focuses on jazz and jazz musicians, and that's what he's best known for. But his community activism, his love for people, his commitment to social justice, and the inclusiveness of all people of all ages and race and sexual orientation.
That's why I said a visual historian, because it really was of a time and place, but it was more than just the jazz. It was the culture, the sense of now, and how people are creating stories in their head. I mean, I believe that completely, that my work has the power to do this.
I think Herb's work is very timely right now.
I'm not a bad guy, man. In the car. I'm not a bad guy. You ain't gonna win.
George Floyd happens, and this whole kind of awakening, and the whole, I do think and I do hope that as a society, with all the other static going on, that we did have some fundamental change where there was this deeper realization of the really systemic racism in our society that we've all just kind of gone along with. Hopefully, black, white, whatever, we've all had an awakening about what really is happening and how we should behave going forward.
Well, 20 years ago tonight, St. Pete police in riot gear struggled to control a violent crowd in South St. Pete. A white police officer had just killed an unarmed black man.
So I call up Herb and I said, Herb, I said, you've been awakened to this your entire life. I've never heard of Tyronne Lewis. How many people were you shouldering out of the way to take these photographs? I'm sure there was nobody there taking these photographs, but Herb was. And so what I wanted to highlight by that was we may have had an awakening just this summer, and I just had an awakening this summer, but Herb's been woke his whole life, because this is what is part and parcel to his character and the story he's been trying to tell, both with his jazz and with all of his street photography.
Well, we've been saying this all along. So again, the camera does not lie in this way. This culture has an ugliness to it. It's not always pretty, but it's come up for healing, in my opinion.
So even in our exhibition, which started out to be planned just as the jazz musicians, it expanded to show his documentation of LGBTQ rights or anything that really needed attention. He was very sensitive to the world he was living in, and really his upbringing and his touring with these jazz musicians informed his whole career and his life.
This is what I wanted to do. This is how I saw my life evolving. Putting into my world my totality so that it's just not jazz, civil rights, portraits. I mean, it's all of it. It's all of it.
I think what I learned the most from Herb was, how to just be a good guy and be a great person. And the art's there, and you have a career of art. Your ego and everything has to go along with that, and you have to, remain humble and in the community in a way that you're looked upon highly, and Herb's that guy.
I think Herb's works will endure because they captured important aspects of life and history. When you capture life and history and you portray it accurately and genuinely, it is a prized possession, because generations ahead can learn from it and they can build on it. And I think that's the important part, because there's an influence there that other journalists, other photojournalists, other artists, other people with different races understand that it's not just their race that they have a responsibility for. They have a responsibility for humanity, and to uplift and to support and to fight against oppression. This is our mission. This is our purpose. This is our passion. This is humanity.
When I look at an artist that's had that much experience over that many years, that's what I want, and that's what I aspire to be.
I owe him the respect as an artist and as a human being to then carry forth the ideals that he brought forth, the sharings that he brought, and to continue to share in his spirit. And this is what I do with Images of Life.
I knew Nina and Waverly's work. They're one of only 3 black ballet companies in the United States. And I had worked with them on many occasions. So when this amazing photography exhibition came up, I immediately thought of Nina and Waverly as potential partners to see if they would be interested in creating something really special. Waverly loved jazz, and it informed his whole life. They came, they saw the work, they were inspired, and we worked with them to co-commission a piece of dance based on these works.
I see skies of blue and clouds of white, bright blessed day and the dark sacred night, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
There was one quote that we used in the exhibition that I think Herb lived his life by, and it was, "Injustice for one is injustice for all." And that was really it. It went beyond color, it went beyond race. I mean, I think Herb factors those in and realized what was behind the motivation behind people, and he just wanted to make the world right through his photographs. I mean, that's all he was trying to do.
And I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
that makes me feel proud. That makes me feel very proud.